Is there a healthy way to deconstruct? I get asked this question all the time, and I get it. There's lots of conflicting information out there. There's a lot of Christian writers and content makers that would say, no, it's impossible to deconstruct in a healthy way. And then there are other Christian writers and content makers that would say, not only is there a healthy way to do it, it's unhealthy not to. Everyone should do it all the time. So, what's my take? Well, stick around for the whole video to see. If we haven't met, I'm Chase. I'm a pastor, an author, a teacher, and once a week I drop a video about all things deconstruction. So, what do I say when I get asked this question? Is there a healthy way to deconstruct? I would say the right answer is probably somewhere in the middle. And I don't like to use the terms healthy or not healthy. I prefer the terms Jesus used, which was wise and foolish, but we'll get there in a moment. Even just a quick reading of the Bible shows us, if anything, that Jesus made room for doubt in the lives of his followers. If there's anything we know for sure about Jesus, it's that he was constantly surrounded by doubters. I mean, think about it. His own half-brothers and half-sisters doubted him all the way until his resurrection. There were the religious leaders of his own people, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the teachers of the law. In the Gospels, especially the book of John, we see them doubting Jesus every step of the way. But it wasn't just people outside of his inner circle that doubted his identity and claims. It was his closest followers as well. I mean, "O you of little faith" is a thing that Jesus says a lot in the Bible. John the Baptist, the person that prepared the way for Jesus, he even got to a point where he said, "Hey, are you really who I think you are?" And even Jesus' own disciples stepped in and out of doubt constantly during their 3 years with Jesus. During all of these encounters with doubters, Jesus never dismissed or pushed away a single one. In fact, he moved near them and made room for their doubts as they explored whether they were ready to make a decision to follow him or not. The disciples that were handed the Great Commission by Jesus himself were themselves in a state of doubt in that moment. You can read it for yourself in Matthew 28:17. And not only did Jesus make room in his kingdom, even the leadership of his kingdom, for those that experienced doubt, but he also, I think, catered a lot of his teachings to those in the process of examining the truths that he proclaimed about his kingdom. One example is in Matthew 7:24-27. Let me read it for you. Jesus says, "Anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise, like a person who builds a house on solid rock. Though the rains come in torrents and the floodwaters rise and the winds beat against that house, it won't collapse because it's built on bedrock. But anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey it is foolish, like a person who builds a house on sand. When the rains and floods come and the winds beat against that house, it will collapse with a mighty crash." Now, Jesus is saying a lot in this parable, but one of the things he says is that you can either build your faith on the rock, on a solid foundation, or on the sand, on a shaky foundation. So Jesus calls every single person who would follow him to pause and examine what their faith is really built on, because whatever that foundation is, it's going to have real world consequences. See, Jesus knows that the storms of life are going to hit us all. Pain and suffering will come our way. Financial hardship is going to affect you. Christian leaders, sadly, will fall. Sinful people that call themselves Christ followers are going to hurt other people. Teachers of the Bible are going to use the Bible to support unjust and immoral causes. And when those storms hit, whatever you've built your faith on will determine whether it stands strong or collapses and washes away, bringing you along with it. So, is this worthy of building my entire life on is a question that all of us should ask repeatedly throughout our lives. And we would be wise to act and change our foundation if the answer to that question is no. In fact, we see many people in the Bible do this very thing, this very wise thing, abandon their current foundation for one that's new and more robust. Like Thomas, he was one of Jesus' followers. He was a Jew, and because of that, he was taught from an early age about a Messiah that was to come. Like most of the Jewish people before Jesus, Thomas believed, and he was taught by others to believe, that the Messiah would set up an earthly kingdom and bring peace or shalom back into the world through the physical nation of Israel. He was taught that the Messiah would rule as a human king forever. Like this was part of his foundation, part of the structure that held up his faith. But when he watched Jesus, who he thought was that promised Messiah, be arrested and crucified and die, that foundation was rocked. So Jesus' death was this immense storm that caused a crisis of faith for Thomas. In this moment of crisis, he thought, okay, I've been taught that the Messiah will not die. I've been taught that only evil people die on crosses. I've been taught that the crucifixion is really God's way of punishing apostates and liars. I've been taught all of these things, and if these things that I've been taught are true, then Jesus must not be the Messiah that I thought he was. On the other hand, if Jesus is the Messiah, he's a very different sort of Messiah than we were expecting. And many of the things I've been taught, they can't be true. So he came to a crossroads where he had to pit Jesus against some of his deeply held beliefs. And that's a disorienting place to be. So for a few days at least, Thomas chose to deny Jesus and hold on to the truths passed down to him by his family. Even when news spread that Jesus had risen from the grave and the other disciples told him about it, look at how he responds in John 20, verse 25. I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands and put my fingers into them and place my hand into the wound in his side. You see, unlike some of the other disciples, Thomas needed proof. He needed proof before he would even entertain the idea of throwing away his current foundation in order to start the long process of tearing that foundation down and building on a new one. And Jesus in his grace gave Thomas the proof that he required. Look what happens later in that chapter. It says this, 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. And the doors were locked, but suddenly as before, Jesus was standing among them. Peace be with you, he said. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. My Lord and my God, Thomas exclaimed. Notice that Jesus doesn't get mad at Thomas for demanding proof. He doesn't shame him for doubting. He understands the crisis of faith that Thomas and many of the other disciples were in that moment. He doesn't disregard their disorientation. In fact, he pursues him in order to give Thomas exactly what he was searching for, physical proof that Jesus truly was the Messiah, although a very different sort of Messiah than one all of Israel was looking for. So if you think about it, Jesus destroyed Thomas's previous foundation in order to give him something stronger and more resilient to build on. Not the teachings handed down by his parents, but instead the foundation of a risen and reigning Lord that he could touch with his hands and see with his eyes. Now, once Thomas was finally willing to throw his old foundation away and accept this new foundation, then and only then could he begin the process of rebuilding his faith, of leaving behind what he thought he knew about God and rebuilding upon the truth, the foundation of Jesus. So Thomas got rid of the foundation handed to him by his parents and allowed Jesus to become his foundation instead. So he deconstructed in order to reconstruct. And there's a long list of people that went through a similar deconstruction, reconstruction process in the Bible. Saul, who would later go by the name Paul, is on that list. He gives us insight into his deconstruction and reconstruction process in Galatians 1, verses 13 and 18. You can go and read it. But like Thomas, Saul had deeply held beliefs that his parents had taught him, beliefs that their parents had taught them. He was taught that the Messiah would be a man and not God. He was taught that Jesus was a liar and that this new Christian movement was evil. But when Saul met Jesus face to face, he was forced to question that foundation. And so he tells the Galatians that he went through a 3-year process of deconstructing his old beliefs and reconstructing on the foundation of Jesus. As you read through the Bible looking for people that went through this type of process, you're going to start to find them everywhere. So what makes us think that we are any different from Thomas or Paul? Well, you might say, Chase, we're Christians, right? They weren't Christians. They were converting to another brand new religion. We Christians don't have to go through that process. And I would say, really? Like, I would disagree. The hard truth is that in America, at least, many people have been brought up in a biblically naive and culturally influenced form of Christianity. So there are certain truths that we grew up being taught were really, really important that simply aren't found anywhere in the Bible. In contrast, there's also some really important truths and doctrines that are in the Bible that we haven't been taught at all. And what this means is that most of us that were brought up in a Christian home in America, we need to take the time to think hard and to research and to search God's word to figure out what parts of our faith can and should be thrown away and what parts need to be added. If you think about it, in a way, people who convert to Christianity from a different religion or like no religion at all, they've already gone through this double process of deconstruction, reconstruction. They've already come to grips with the faultiness of their foundation, and they've had to think long and hard about the implications that Jesus, as their new foundation, has for their lives. So Christians raised in a Christian home, though I think blessed by 1,000 other blessings, have often missed out on this hard but needed process. So when a Christian begins to ask questions or express doubts, when they start to kick and hammer and investigate and really look at their foundation, they're just going through the same process every convert that Jesus has gone through for the past 2,000 years. So I would say it's a good thing. It's a wise thing if it's done in a wise way. That's another thing Jesus tells us in his parable. There's a wise way and there's a foolish way to do this deconstruction, reconstruction work. There's a wise way and there's a foolish way to tear down and to build back up. Let me give you an example. I've spent a lot of time working alongside my brother-in-law and his construction business. Now, he's a lot more skilled than I'll ever be, but I've learned to do a decent job at things like replacing outside trim. So often we would get called out to a home where an exterior windowsill had water damage or a soffit underneath the roof had rotted because of moisture. And so my job that first day would always be to assess the damage, to kind of examine what was really going on. And it was my job because it doesn't take a whole lot of skill. You just take a hammer and a mini crowbar and you pry away all the rotten pieces of wood until you're left with some framing that you can rebuild on. So sometimes I'd go out there and check it out and I'd realize I only need to remove one little board. The builders forgot to put primer on an edge, or a gutter was tilted a little too far towards the house. And so I just removed the bad board and put up a new one. It was a quick and easy fix. And that might be you right now. Like, by the grace of God, your parents or pastors handed you a really good and sturdy faith. And there's only one or two areas that you might need to rethink or reconsider. There might be something that you've made extremely important that's really just a secondary issue in the Bible. Or there's something that you've made secondary that's actually primary in the Bible. But then there would be times where I would pry back that initial board and realize there was not a whole lot of rotten wood, but there was a whole lot of mold that had spread to other places in the structure. And so when we found this, we'd have to pry off even healthy boards so we could gain access to all the mold and treat it with bleach and fix the damage. And that might be you as well. Most of your foundation and theology is correct. It's true. It's just that it's been taught to you or lived out in a judgmental or a prideful way. Or maybe sins like lust or anger or bitterness or jealousy have started to kind of grow unchecked in your heart. Or you've confused the kingdom of God with a certain political party. Or you've used your theology to justify hating your neighbors instead of loving them. Whatever it is, if this is you, you probably need to do a little more deconstruction than the first group, but this is so that you can protect the correct foundation you have from getting worse in the future. Sometimes, though, we'd pry back that initial board and we'd find that the whole side of the house was damaged beyond repair. And so we had to strip everything away until we got down to the cement foundation and start to reconstruct from there. And that might be you as well. Maybe what you think of as Christianity really isn't Christianity at all. Maybe you need to go back all the way to the foundation of Jesus and start building afresh from there. I've counseled and walked with people in all of these categories. I think all of us are in one of those groups or somewhere in between. But hear me when I say this, that's okay. Jesus wants to give you a safe place to work through those issues. And as long as you have the foundation of Jesus Christ, who lived and died and rose again, you have a strong foundation that you can continue to build on. That's the wise way. But there's also a foolish way. You know what would have been a very unwise or foolish thing for me to do when I showed up to one of those job sites? It would have been very unwise of me to look at that rotten piece of windowsill or that rotten board, refuse to examine it further, shake my head in disapproval, knock on the homeowner's door and say, hey, bad news, homeowner, your windowsill is rotten. You got to bulldoze the whole thing down and move. You got water damage in 1 square foot of your house. I think you should burn it all down and go live in an RV somewhere. No wise person would ever do that. Why? Because the foundation and 90% of the framing are still good for all we know. And yet that's what I see people do with Christianity all the time. They go about their deconstruction in an unwise way. They encounter one question about their faith that they've never considered before, which is not uncommon. They begin to doubt a little bit, which is okay and even healthy in most cases. They begin to search for an answer, which is what everyone should do, but then they come to the conclusion that because they can't understand a handful of points about their faith, or because someone who happens to have a PhD tells them they can't believe in the Bible at all, then this whole Christianity thing must be wrong. And they so quickly throw out what billions of people have tested and studied and proven and even died for over 2,000 years. I mean, think about it. The amount of people who have left their faith in Jesus is like a teaspoon of water in an ocean of people who have asked the same questions and come out with an even stronger faith on the other side. They pick up a sledgehammer when what they really need is some sandpaper. They take out the dynamite when they really just need a paintbrush. And so I want to plead with those of you currently undergoing deconstruction to not throw away your faith because the Christians you know can't answer some critiques that Rob Bell or like an angry TikToker is spouting. I'd encourage you to not walk away from your faith just because you found a few cracks in your current foundation. I want to ask you to be brave and bold enough to swim against the current caused by the echo chambers of the internet and take the time to really research and discover the Jesus of history and the Bible. I want you to do the hard but wise work of thoroughly inspecting your current foundation, yes, but don't confuse your current foundation with the one that Jesus offers you. I think you'll be surprised how easily the answers you're searching for can really be found. See, the foundation of Christianity, it's not a theological system. It's not this doctrinal house of cards. It's not the tradition of church leaders that you've come into contact with. No, listen closely. The foundation of Christianity is a man who lived and died and rose from the grave named Jesus, whose life and teachings we have access to through the credible words of a miraculously preserved historical document that we call the Bible. And I hope to prove all of that to you on this channel. But this historical reality, Jesus, is the only foundation that we can build a meaningful and robust life upon in order to withstand all the storms that will inevitably come our way. So, do I think it's a good or a healthy thing to deconstruct? I do think it's a good thing to do this double work of deconstruction and reconstruction, no matter how many well-meaning Christians might disagree with me. I think it's a safe thing to express your doubts and seek an answer to them. I say this because I believe the answers you're looking for are there. And the answers are there because the Messiah is there, inviting you to come and see the evidence that you uniquely need. In the next video, we're going to begin to look at some of the evidence for Jesus's uniqueness and slowly build on what we can concretely know for sure about him on the foundation of Jesus. Now, it's going to be slow and methodical work, but I promise you, if you hang with me, it's going to be worth the effort. We're going to begin our reconstruction work with a piece of foundation that makes or breaks the case for Christianity, the resurrection. But that's next week. So like and subscribe and send this to a friend if this was helpful, and I will see you in 7 days.